It was January 30th, 1945. The Baltic Sea, once a serene expanse of blue, had turned into a frozen corridor of death. The German ship Wilhelm Gustloff sat in the port of Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, trembling under the gray skies. Snow drifted down like ashes from a dying world. On board, thousands of refugees, women, children, wounded soldiers waited in silence. They were not soldiers of conquest anymore. They were the remnants of a collapsing Reich, desperate to flee the Red Army sweeping through East Prussia with fire and vengeance. The decks overflowed with faces, pale, hollow, trembling from hunger and terror. Mothers clutched infants wrapped in rags. Old men muttered prayers. Teenagers, once members of the Hitler Youth, now looked like frightened children. They all believed this ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, would save them. It was their last chance to escape before the Soviet advance turned the region into a slaughterhouse. Few knew that the vessel, designed to carry 800 people, now groaned under the weight of more than 10,000 souls. The ship had been a symbol of Nazi pride once, a strength-through-joy cruise liner built to display Germany's glory. But that night she was nothing more than a lifeboat for the doomed. Below decks, corridors reeked of sweat, urine, and fear. Air grew thin, and the cries of infants mixed with the hum of engines. Every heartbeat was a reminder that they were alive, at least for now. Outside, ice crusted over the deck rails and the sea whispered promises of refuge and ruin. The captain, Friedrich Petersen, gave the order to depart. The engines roared, churning the icy waters. From the harbor, a few remaining soldiers watched, silently as the ship slipped into the night, its lights glowing faintly through the fog. No one on board realized they were sailing into the deadliest maritime disaster in history. As the Wilhelm Gustloff moved further into the Baltic, the lights of Gotenhafen faded into the distance. Only the wind remained, a cruel, unfeeling witness to what was about to unfold. By the time the Wilhelm Gustloff reached open water, the decks were an ocean of bodies. Every corridor, stairwell, and cabin was crammed beyond measure. The vessel, meant for 800 passengers, now carried more than 5 times that number: soldiers, sailors, nurses, civilians, and children. Many huddled together under blankets made of old uniforms or curtains ripped from abandoned homes. Each face told a story of loss. Behind every pair of eyes lay the ruins of a life left behind. Among them were young naval auxiliaries, teenage girls who once worked at training bases. They had been told they'd be evacuated to safety, away from the front lines. Now they sat quietly on the lower decks, their blue uniforms stained with grime and fear. Near them, wounded soldiers lay on stretchers, some missing limbs, others barely conscious. The sound of coughing, sobbing, and whispered prayers echoed through the steel hull. Captain Petersen and his officers faced impossible decisions. The ship had no proper escort, no real defense against the submarines lurking in the depths. Yet, turning back meant certain capture by the advancing Soviets, whose vengeance was feared beyond words. Every officer knew the risk, but none could have imagined how swiftly death would come. As night fell, a deep fog swallowed the horizon. The captain, against all caution, ordered the navigation lights turned on, hoping to avoid collision with friendly vessels in the crowded escape route. It was a decision made for safety, and it would doom them all. Because beneath the icy surface a Soviet submarine was watching. The S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, prowled the Baltic like a predator in the dark. Marinesko had been disgraced before the mission, but he was determined to reclaim his honor. When he saw the faint glow of the Gustloff's lights slicing through the fog, he made his choice. He would strike. Above the waves, the passengers slept uneasily. Some mothers sang softly to their children. Others stared out into the Black Sea, whispering names of loved ones left behind. They thought they were heading toward life. In truth, they were racing toward the abyss. Captain Marinesko of the S-13 was a man at war with himself as much as with the enemy. His career had been nearly destroyed by insubordination and drink, but in that frozen January, he sought redemption in the only way he knew, by sinking German ships fleeing the east. His submarine had been shadowing the refugee routes for days, silent, patient, waiting for prey. On the evening of January 30th, he found it. Through the periscope, the silhouette of the Wilhelm Gustloff appeared ghostly and immense. Marinesco did not know how many civilians were aboard. To him, it was an enemy troopship, part of Germany's desperate evacuation. He saw the glowing navigation lights and mistook them for arrogance. "She's ours," he is said to have muttered. At 9 p.m., he ordered the tubes ready. The sea held its breath. Inside the submarine, men whispered short prayers as they loaded the torpedoes. Each one was named. For the motherland. For Leningrad. For my brother. At 9:16 p.m., Marinesco gave the order. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. 3 torpedoes shot out into the dark, cutting through the water like arrows toward the glowing German liner. On board the Wilhelm Gustloff, no one knew. Music still played faintly over the loudspeakers, an orchestra recording from better times. Some people were even laughing, momentarily forgetting the war. But within seconds, the first torpedo struck, tearing into the forward section. The explosion ripped through the decks, throwing people from their bunks. The second torpedo hit near the swimming pool, where hundreds of young naval auxiliaries had been resting. They were vaporized in an instant. The third struck near the engine room, cutting power to the ship. The lights went out. The music stopped. A terrible silence hung for a heartbeat. Then screams filled the darkness. Above, chaos erupted. The once mighty ship shuddered, began to list. Passengers trampled one another in blind panic, clawing for the lifeboats. Mothers screamed for their children. Soldiers tried to restore order, but the ship was already dying. Within minutes, it began to tilt dangerously toward the port side. Below, the sea rushed in with merciless speed. The corridors that had been filled with life moments before now became tombs. And in the distance, deep beneath the waves, Captain Marinesco listened to the echo of explosions and whispered, "Hit confirmed." The Wilhelm Gustloff was now tilting sharply, her bow sinking into the Black Sea. Panic spread faster than the water itself. The ship's corridors turned into rivers as terrified passengers fought to reach the upper decks. Screams of children and the deafening groan of tearing steel echoed through the ship, creating a sound so horrific that survivors would later say it never left their ears. Those on the lower decks, mostly women, children, and wounded soldiers, had little chance. The lights had gone out and the hallways were pitch black. People groped through the dark, slipping on wet floors, their hands finding cold metal or limp bodies. Some prayed. Others pounded on locked doors, calling for help that would never come. The torpedo strikes had sealed most exits. The sea was already inside the ship, flooding faster than anyone could move. On the upper decks, chaos reigned. Officers tried to organize the evacuation, shouting orders into the storm of panic. But the lifeboats were frozen to their davits. Sailors smashed at the ice with hammers, their hands bleeding, their breath white in the cold air. Others cut ropes desperately, only to see lifeboats crash into the water below, killing those inside or dragging them beneath the waves. Within 20 minutes, the ship's deck was a scene from hell. Mothers thrust babies into strangers' arms, begging them to save them. Soldiers stripped off heavy coats and tried to dive into the freezing Baltic. The temperature of the water was below freezing. It would kill in minutes. From above, the once grand liner looked like a wounded beast bleeding light into the sea. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not just sinking, it was dying, and with it, 10,000 souls cried out into the night. As the ship tilted further, a great wave swept across the deck, knocking people into the sea. The icy water cut like knives against their skin. Many never surfaced again. Their lungs seized from the cold before they could even scream. Those who did survive the initial plunge clung to debris, lifebelts, or the bodies of others. The Black Sea around the sinking ship became a field of desperate figures. Cries echoed in every direction. Children calling for mothers, men shouting names into the void. The ship's hull groaned one final time before a massive roar split the air. The Wilhelm Gustloff was breaking apart. Her bow plunged beneath the surface, followed by the stern rising high, silhouetted against the night sky like a monument to tragedy. Then, with a thunderous hiss, she disappeared. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Only the wind and the faint sound of water lapping against wreckage remained. Survivors floated together in clusters, their breath forming mist that drifted away like ghosts. The sea was dotted with faint lights, tiny lamps from lifebelts glowing eerily across the water. Rescue ships had been dispatched, but they were far away. Hours would pass before help arrived, and most would not live to see it. Exposure to the cold would claim thousands. The cries grew weaker, then fewer, until only the sound of the waves remained. By the time the rescue vessels finally reached the area, less than 1,000 people were still alive. They pulled children with frozen limbs, mothers clutching lifeless infants, men whose eyes stared blankly into nothing. The rescuers themselves wept as they worked. The sea that night had devoured nearly 9,000 souls, more than the Titanic, the Lusitania and the Britannic combined. The Baltic, once calm and silent, had become the largest graveyard in maritime history. When dawn broke on January 31st, 1945, the Baltic Sea was eerily calm. Pieces of wreckage floated across the waves, children's shoes, a doll, a broken violin, fragments of lifeboats. The rescuers scanned the waters in silence, their faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. They had expected to find hundreds of survivors. Instead, they found death. The official death toll would never be known exactly. Estimates ranged from 8,000 to over 9,000 people. But numbers could not capture the horror of what happened. Families were wiped out entirely. Whole villages lost their women and children in one night. For many, there were no graves, no markers, just the endless sea. The tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff was overshadowed by the war itself. When it ended months later, the world's attention turned to the ruins of Berlin, the liberation of camps, and the birth of the atomic age. The sinking of a German ship carrying mostly civilians did not fit neatly into the story of good versus evil. And so, history turned away. For decades, survivors were silent. Some feared being accused of Nazi sympathy. Others could not bear to speak of it. Those who did remember described the same nightmare: the sound of children screaming in the dark, the shock of icy water, the faces that vanished beneath the waves. The sea kept its secrets. The Wilhelm Gustloff lay on the seabed 44 meters below the surface, her hull twisted and broken. No memorial marked her resting place. Only in recent years would divers rediscover her wreck, a silent reminder of a forgotten catastrophe. Yet for those who lived through it, every cold night brought it back: the screams, the darkness, the falling ship. The day the sea became their grave. Aboard the Soviet submarine S-13, Captain Alexander Marinesko stood in the conning tower, his face lit by the faint glow of instrument lights. He had been stalking the Wilhelm Gustloff for hours. To him, it wasn't a ship of refugees. It was a legitimate military target. Intelligence reports said it carried U-boat trainees and Nazi personnel. In war, such distinctions could mean the difference between duty and guilt. When the torpedoes struck, Marinesko didn't cheer. He simply watched through his periscope as the massive vessel shuddered and began to list. The radio operator noted the time: 9:16 p.m. It was routine. Another enemy ship sunk. Another report to send to Moscow. Yet even as the Wilhelm Gustloff slipped beneath the waves, Marinesko's crew felt uneasy. They could hear faint cries through the hull, the sound of human agony carried by the sea. Later, when they surfaced, Marinesko looked out at the black water. There were lights everywhere, small flickering glows from life vests. He realized too late that this had not been a troop convoy. The lights stretched for miles, each one marking a life lost. Some of his men began to weep. Others looked away, silent. No one spoke. The submarine turned north, vanishing into the Baltic darkness. In Moscow, Marinesko would be neither celebrated nor condemned. His superiors disliked him. He drank heavily, had disciplinary problems, and had previously been demoted. Though he had sunk the largest ship in history, the Soviet Union made no mention of it in wartime propaganda. The victims were mostly civilians, and the incident was politically inconvenient. Decades later, long after his death, Marinesko was posthumously honored as a hero of the Soviet Union. But even that recognition was uneasy and a strange reward for a man whose greatest victory had drowned thousands of innocent women and children, the survivors of the Wilhelm Gustloff were few, but their memories were seared into history with painful clarity. Many were rescued by German torpedo boats or nearby vessels hours after the sinking. They spoke of floating in freezing darkness, clinging to debris surrounded by the dead. One young girl, Ava, remembered holding her mother's hand as the lifeboat capsized. When she surfaced, her mother was gone. The sea was full of faces, she said years later, but none of them moved. Another survivor, a nurse named Lotta, described how her hair froze to the wooden plank she was lying on. The screams stopped one by one, she whispered. Then there was only silence. The rescuers faced their own horror. They pulled frozen children from the water, some still holding dolls or blankets. Their eyes were open as if still alive. One sailor wrote in his diary that he wished he had never seen the sea again. Many of those who survived the night later died of frostbite or shock. The human body could not endure such cold for long. When they reached land, the survivors were not greeted as victims, but as displaced persons in a collapsing empire. Germany was losing the war. Refugees crowded every town, every road, every barn. There were no ceremonies for the dead, no official mourning. The Wilhelm Gustloff was just another loss in a nation drowning in tragedy. But for those who lived, the memories never faded. Some would tell their stories decades later in documentaries or memoirs. Others never spoke again, haunted by the faces of those they left behind. The Baltic, they said, never gave back what it took that night. In the years that followed World War II, the Wilhelm Gustloff vanished from public memory. Neither East nor West wanted to talk about it. The Soviets saw no reason to highlight an attack that killed civilians. The new East German regime couldn't afford to paint the Soviet Union as an aggressor. And in the West, Germany's role as the instigator of the war overshadowed its own tragedies. For survivors, the silence was unbearable. They wrote letters to newspapers and government offices, asking for memorials, for recognition, for someone to say their loss mattered. But their pleas were ignored. There were no monuments, no official day of remembrance. History simply moved on. When divers first located the wreck in the 1950s, the Soviet Union declared it a protected war grave. No one was to disturb it, but in secret some divers explored its shattered hull. They described scenes frozen in time, cabins filled with skeletal remains, children's toys resting on the floor, and corridors still lined with ice. The ship had become an underwater tomb. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff began to re-emerge. Documentaries, books, and survivor testimonies finally brought it back into the light. The world was stunned. How could history's deadliest shipwreck remain forgotten for nearly half a century? The answer was simple. In a war filled with unspeakable horrors, even the greatest maritime disaster could disappear in the shadow of everything else. Yet for those who had lived through that night, silence was the final cruelty. Their suffering had been swallowed, first by the sea, then by history itself. By the 1980s, whispers of the Wilhelm Gustloff began resurfacing among divers and maritime historians. The wreck, lying 44 meters beneath the icy Baltic waters off the coast of Poland, had become a ghostly secret, a place of eerie stillness and unresolved grief. Those who dared to descend described it as hauntingly preserved. Plates still sat on tables. Bunks remained stacked with rotted blankets. The ship's nameplate, though corroded, could still be read beneath layers of algae. Divers spoke of a suffocating silence inside the wreck, as if the ship itself mourned. Some reported seeing children's shoes floating in the corridors, or the faint outlines of human figures still seated in dining rooms. Over the decades, the Baltic's cold, brackish waters had acted like a time capsule, preserving a moment of catastrophe and chilling detail. But not everyone viewed it with reverence. In the years of economic struggle that followed the war, looters dove into the wreck in search of valuables, jewelry, silverware, even military insignia. Polish authorities later outlawed such dives, designating the site as a maritime grave. Yet the damage had already been done. Artifacts surfaced in black markets, traded like relics from another world. For historians, the Wilhelm Gustloff was more than a wreck. It was a moral riddle. It forced them to confront uncomfortable truths, that even in a war as black and white as World War II, tragedy spared no one. The victims on that ship were German civilians, but they were also human beings fleeing horror. The line between guilt and innocence blurred in those frozen waves. Each year, fewer survivors remained to tell their stories. Yet divers still returned to the site, drawn by something they couldn't name. Beneath the dark waters, they said, the Wilhelm Gustloff still seemed to whisper, not for justice, but for remembrance. For decades, Germany's post-war generation grew up knowing little or nothing about the Wilhelm Gustloff. In schools, history books devoted pages to Allied bombings, concentration camps, and the Holocaust, all central to the moral reckoning of Germany's past. But the suffering of German civilians, including the thousands who died fleeing the East, remained taboo. Some believed it was better that way. How could a nation responsible for such devastation claim victimhood? But for the survivors of the Gustloff, that silence was its own kind of punishment. They were haunted not only by memories of that night, but by the knowledge that their suffering was seen as unworthy of sympathy. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a new generation of historians began to challenge that silence. They argued that remembering civilian losses did not absolve Germany of its crimes. It merely completed the picture of a war that devoured everyone. Documentaries aired across Europe, and for the first time, survivors' testimonies were broadcast to millions. Their voices trembled, but they spoke with dignity. One woman, interviewed in her 80s, said, "We were told to forget, but I still dream of the ship. I hear the water rushing in. I feel my child's hand slipping from mine." Her words broke decades of silence, piercing through the guilt and politics that had buried her pain. The Wilhelm Gustloff became more than a shipwreck. It became a symbol of what happens when memory itself drowns. It reminded the world that history's duty is not to choose sides in grief, but to tell the truth, even when that truth hurts. As the Cold War ended and the archives opened, historians pieced together the final moments of the Wilhelm Gustloff with forensic precision. They discovered official naval logs, survivor accounts, and even Marinesco's submarine records. The details painted a devastating picture, not of malice, but of miscalculation, of chaos in a collapsing world. For decades, Soviet officials had quietly acknowledged the sinking, but dismissed the civilian losses as an unfortunate consequence of war. Western scholars, on the other hand, struggled with how to frame the tragedy. Could the sinking of a German refugee ship be called a war crime? The answer was complicated. The Wilhelm Gustloff was technically a military transport, armed and carrying Nazi officers, but the thousands of women and children aboard made it a humanitarian disaster of unimaginable scale. The moral ambiguity was staggering. In that gray zone, the Gustloff became a mirror reflecting the entire war's contradictions: heroism and cruelty, victory and loss, humanity and horror. For every soldier who fired a weapon, there was a mother clutching her child. For every triumph, a tragedy drowned quietly beneath the waves. Today, the ship lies broken on the seafloor, its steel hull split open like a wound that never healed. Currents sweep through its corridors, stirring up sand and silence. It is both a grave and a warning that even the victors' stories have shadows. In remembrance ceremonies held each January, survivors and their families light candles and float them on the Baltic waters. As the flames drift away, they say the same words, almost like a prayer: "We remember you now." And for a brief moment, the sea glows, as if returning the light of all it once took. When modern sonar first mapped the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff in the early 2000s, the image shocked even seasoned experts. The once proud liner lay on her port side, split open by the torpedo's impact. The outlines of lifeboats still clung to their davits, and the gaping holes where thousands tried to escape seemed almost to breathe. Journalists and documentarians began flocking to Gdynia and Łeba, the coastal Polish towns closest to the wreck site. Locals recalled stories passed down by fishermen who had pulled frozen bodies from the sea for weeks after the disaster. Some remembered the eerie nights when waves washed fragments of furniture, shoes, and photographs onto the beach. One man told a film crew, "The sea never forgot. Every winter it gives something back." The rediscovery reignited international interest. Museums in Germany, Poland, and Russia began collecting survivor testimonies, letters, and artifacts. In Lübeck, a small exhibition called The Forgotten Voyage opened to the public. Its first display was a rusted ship's bell, pulled from the wreck by a diver. Visitors stood silently before it as though waiting for a sound that would never come again. But as the world remembered the Titanic with blockbuster films and global memorials, The Wilhelm Gustloff remained largely overlooked. Its tragedy carried political discomfort. Unlike the Titanic, its victims were German refugees, a reminder of the war's shifting moral landscape. Some still argued that remembrance risked sympathy for the perpetrators. Others countered that refusing to remember was an injustice to the innocent dead. Thus, the Wilhelm Gustloff became a paradox, a forgotten tragedy that refused to stay buried, echoing through history as the sea's quiet confession of humanity's greatest failures. With every diver's descent and every survivor's fading voice, the Wilhelm Gustloff forced a reckoning about how we define loss. War had turned morality into a battlefield of its own, where even truth became a casualty. The ship's story illuminated that not all victims wear the same uniform, and not all suffering can be weighed against another's guilt. Historians began referring to it as Europe's sunken memory. It symbolized how nations choose which tragedies to remember and which to bury. The Soviet Union celebrated the submarine's captain, Alexander Marinesko, as a hero for decades. Yet he died before the full truth emerged, that his triumph had come at a terrible human cost. When his story was revisited years later, even Russian scholars struggled to reconcile his courage with the innocence of his victims. In Germany, the story of the Gustloff began appearing in literature and film, treated not as a tale of victimhood, but as one of shared human tragedy. Younger generations listened differently. They asked not whether remembering was right, but why it had taken so long. In their eyes, the Gustloff represented the hidden side of every war, where even those fleeing destruction can be swallowed by it. The wreck, still resting in its cold grave, became a classroom for divers and historians alike. Every corroded railing, every scattered shoe, every silent corridor taught a lesson about the cost of forgetting. It reminded them that the sea, like history, never erases what it has swallowed. It merely waits for someone brave enough to look. Today, 80 years after the Wilhelm Gustloff went down, her story continues to surface in documentaries, novels, and memorials. Each January, survivors and descendants gather on Germany's northern coast facing the Baltic. They throw flowers into the water, red for the lost children, white for the mothers, yellow for the sailors. Some cry. Others stand in silence, listening to the waves as though they carry whispers of the dead. There are no grand monuments, no marble statues, only the sea itself, vast and indifferent. But perhaps that is fitting. The Baltic does not distinguish between nations or uniforms. It holds everyone the same way, in cold, unending stillness. To historians, the Wilhelm Gustloff stands as the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. To those who remember, it is something more, a symbol of how tragedy and compassion can coexist even in the darkest corners of human history. The ship's story transcends blame or victory. It speaks instead of the universal frailty that war exposes in us all. Some divers say that when they reach the wreck, they feel an unexplainable peace. The ship, once torn apart by war, now rests quietly in the arms of the sea. Its steel bones no longer echo with screams, only with the rhythm of the tide. And perhaps that is where the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff truly ends. Not in the torpedoes or the fire or the ice, but in the silence that followed. A silence that asks us, across generations, never to let the forgotten remain unseen beneath the waves.